all our distinguished guests, Education Cabinet Member Robert Smith. We've also got Kelly Small and Helen Morgan-Rees. So thanks for making yourselves available. If I just go through a couple of, let's call them operating procedures. The meeting is not live streamed, but is being recorded and published online following the meeting. For people in person, please raise your hand if you want to speak and speak through the mic so everyone online can hear. For people online, which is the majority today, please press the raise hand button when you want to speak. Please leave your mic on mute so no inadvertent messages or comments are made or turned off unless you're speaking. If you're using a laptop in the meeting, please turn off the sound. We are recording. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the main agenda. Apologies if we've received any.
We've had no apologies today.
Thanks very much. Any disclosures? If there are any disclosures, can these please be given? No. And prohibition of whip votes. Minutes of the previous meeting. Can I have someone to accept the minutes as a true record? Thanks very much. Yes, you were here. Cheers. Thank you. Public question time, there's no public questions received. So what we're going to do from here on in is item 6, grants in the Education Department, and I'll hand over to the authors of the report. Thank you very much.
Yeah, what I propose is that we ask the officers to take us through the report and then perhaps we'll have a discussion afterwards, Chair, if that's okay.
Hi, yeah, if I take you through the report, I've based this on the questions that we were provided with prior to the meeting and tried to put that into a report format. Hopefully I've covered what you need there. Just going through, starting at 1.1, the Education Directorate's possibly quite different from other service areas because the majority of grants that we have are given to us. They're not grants that we bid for. There's only a few that we actually bid for ourselves, although the schools can also bid for grants or have grants awarded to them separately. So I've tried to cover schools and education central services in the report. So 1.2 is just noting that grants to schools supplement their annual delegated budget share that they get through the council. And the grants are usually given where there's some new initiative to implement or a political drive from the Welsh Government on a particular area of improvement that's needed across schools. So 1.3 is just noting that grants are temporary by nature and they're usually provided for a short period of time. Quite often what we find is grants eventually, when they end up becoming part of the revenue support grant, the RSG that comes through to the council, and then we get the funding through in a slightly different format. So 1.4 is noting that all grants come with terms and conditions for use and the spending should be in line with those requirements. I'd noted there that often the grant award funding comes but we don't get the terms and conditions at the same time, which can be a little bit unhelpful because we need to wait for the terms and conditions before we can look at how we spend. 1.5 is noting that there's audit required on most grants, either internally or externally, although since writing the report, interestingly, we've had discussions with our internal audit about reducing some of the grant audits because some of the recent terms and conditions that we've had don't actually ask for those audits to take place, and we are considering the workload on schools, so we're looking at reducing the number of audits that take place. Most grants will normally require some sort of claim form or spend plan or monitoring plans as well that we have to provide. So 1.6 is noting about reducing the burden on schools. So the Welsh Government themselves have acknowledged this, and a lot of the previous grants that they used to give to us are now come through the Local Authority Education Grant, the LAG. However, the grant does still have quite a number of subsections with separate terms and conditions and monitoring forms and things like that. So even though it's one grant, there are lots of smaller parts to make that one grant up. 1.7 is noting that schools have their own bank accounts. So there is an administrative process in Swansea to get the money out to our schools. And just noting at the end there that quite often we do get very late grants in the financial year, and the way that schools' budgets work, if the money comes in late, it does end up going into their reserves. So it can sort of artificially then boost school reserves right at the end of the financial year by millions of pounds quite often. 1.8, just noting there that most of our administration for the grants goes through a very small funding and information team, so they do a fantastic job processing all of those grants for us and for schools. And 1.9 is just noting that feedback from the schools is they would actually prefer to have the funding as part of their core delegated budget rather than having separate grants that they have to work with. And that is something that our school budget forum, which is a statutory body that each local authority has to have, we've written to the Welsh and UK governments with that as a request. Section 2 is covering grant governance. We do adhere to the grant, the council's grant application process as in Accounting Instruction 16. And we do take the grant governance very seriously. Schools do have a slightly simplified grant application process called an NGA 3 to try and again reduce the burden for them. So that's for grants that they apply for under £10,000. It only applies to schools. It's not for the centre, for central staff. All key decisions for grant spends come through our strategic leads board. So that's the director, 3 heads of service, and we have 2 associate team managers on SLB as well. We do ensure that all revenue grants are recorded and maintained by that small funding and information team, and we do hold quarterly budget monitoring meetings with all of our team managers, and part of that discussion is looking at the grants as well and how we're spending in line with the grants. And again in 2.4, when we're setting our medium-term financial plan, we consider which grants might be coming to an end to make sure we've got those exit strategies in place, and we have noted on our risk register, you know, where services are heavily reliant on grants to operate. Under section 3, I've given some examples of the education grants that are available for you. So 3.1 is that the largest one that we've got, the LAG that I mentioned before, which is just over £31 million. And that is split into subsections, which I've noted there. So they cover things, you might have heard of Pupil Development Grant, PDG, which is a main grant the schools get. So for example, they are in there. We've got things like the ethnic minority grant. We've got ALN grants, etc., and Welsh grants are all part of that for schools. And I've attached an Appendix A, a little flow chart looking at the PDG, for example, as an example there. So we help schools to determine whether grant is eligible and spending is eligible or not. 3.2 is another big grant that we get each year. This is for post-16 funding. So when we get funding for our schools, we only fund up to 16, and then all schools and colleges for post-16 are funded from MEDA, which is a new body that's been set up to look at that level of education. So we've had £7.1 million from MEDA for this year for the post-16 schools. 3.3 highlights the grants that we've had to date that are based on actual provision rather than us getting a lump sum that we determine how to spend. So the first one there is universal free school meals. So we get funding there based on the number of actual meals that we've provided. The school's essential grant is for school uniform, so that will be based on the number of parental applications for the grant. And then we have food and fun, which comes through the Welsh Local Government Association, and that's where schools run clubs during the school holidays to provide food and activities for their learners. 3.4 then is an example of a grant that we work across the service areas with. So that is for schools and communities. So we work with our colleagues in poverty and prevention teams to decide how much goes to schools, how much goes to the communities. And then we work together then on the claim forms, etc. there. We do try and make things easier for schools again, and what we've done is we've used our contracted supplier to help primary schools to purchase the Pure Dignity products. Section 4 is highlighting some challenges and risks. Obviously, as with all grants under 4.1, although grant funding is welcomed, because it is on an annual basis, it can sometimes hinder your ability to plan strategically over a medium term. 4.2 is highlighting that where some of the sizable grants are used to employ staff, the recruitment process we have in the council can take a couple of months to go through, and obviously that can lead then to sort of underspend if you haven't been able to recruit straight away for the 1st of April, particularly if it's a new grant that you weren't aware that was coming. And obviously when you're looking at people applying for the posts, it is I suppose they are taking a bit of a leap of faith really, going for a post that is grant funded for a year at a time. 4.3 is noting that a lot of the grants we have are on a flat rate, so they don't increase year on year. Of course, as we know, pay and prices do go up year on year, so sometimes that can put a lot of pressure on the services because they either need to reduce the provision or need to try and top up from core budgets. 4.4 is noting that a lot of grants are for additionality. So what we note is that if the grant ends, then the service would have to end as well. I said about PDG, for example, in schools earlier, that is, quite a lot of money that goes out under the PDG grant, and it does cover staffing. So, if that grant were to reduce or cease, then there would be some implications there for staff and potentially redundancies. 4.5 is just noting that for schools, 19% of the resources available to them do come from grants in a typical financial year. And for the centre, it's just noting that, between us and the schools, we've had £49.3 million of grant funding. So it is, a lot of the funding that's available to us. And that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the report. And if you have any questions, we're free to answer them.
Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to? Oh, I can see now. But Mark first, Councillor Tribe.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, all. I'm just wondering whether there's a large disparity between school grants between individual schools, and linked to that, some schools are a bit more proactive in seeking grants. And finally, does each school have its own grants application officer? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, so some of the grants that we get, the Welsh Government or the awarding body will actually determine how much each school gets. So we end up being sort of just the postman, really, to passport that grant onto the schools. So there's only a few really that we can determine ourselves how much each school gets. For example, the post-16 grant is one example where we work with our head teachers of the post-16 schools to determine an allocation formula. So we make sure that we involve the stakeholders as much as we can to make sure that's fair. And as I mentioned earlier, it does come through our SLB for approval as well to make sure the grant goes out. Sorry, I've forgotten the other questions now.
Officers in school.
Oh, yeah. So we don't necessarily have officers in schools that would be looking for grants. In primary schools in particular, you quite often will only have perhaps the one person in the office there. We in secondary schools obviously would have perhaps a slightly larger cohort of staff in the office. What we do try and do is, if we're aware of any grants, we do try and share that information amongst schools to give everybody a fair opportunity to bid. Some of the grants the schools will bid for can be quite small. Tesco, for example, might do a grant, or they might have small lottery grants. But the primary support officers who work with the primary schools do tend to share information amongst the other schools.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you.
If I could come in.
Thanks very much.
If I could come in on that, I think Kelly has said it, that a lot of those grants that are available for people to bid for would be very small amounts of money and often ad hoc funding. I mean, we are talking about the core funding that's either allocated per pupil by ourselves as an authority in accordance with the school funding formula, or these grants that come from Welsh Government, where in reality it's funding rather than grants, because the schools wouldn't apply for them. And I think that's that would be a retrograde step, to be honest. If schools are having to apply for funding, employ officers to do that, that is a bureaucratic system, and it's the type of thing that we would want to move away from. And historically, Welsh Government have committed to that, and I mean, whether we can come back to the extent to which they've achieved their ambition in that respect, but we would be looking towards grants being allocated according to some kind of formula based on the characteristics of the school or the number of pupils or whatever.
Councillor Black, did you want to come in?
Sorry, just find my thing. So I thought Di Jenkins was ahead of me.
You were right, Councillor Black.
I'll come in now if you want. If you want to get Di to go first.
Is Di okay? Di, Councillor Jenkins, is it okay that I bring Peter in first, as I did go to him?
Certainly.
Thanks very much.
Right, just on paragraph 4.4, the school standards and the pupil development grant are, I think, the biggest grants which go to education. So, that, as I understand, they all go directly to the school. So I'm just wondering, what is the involvement of the Central Education Department? Do they have any involvement in administering those grants? And what level and what administration is involved in terms of the school, in terms of reporting back, for example, on those grants?
Yes, so these are examples where we are, like I said, acting as postman in the main for the grant, because the schools have their own bank accounts. The local authority has to receive the money and then passport it on. The Welsh Government won't give the money directly to the schools for their bank accounts. There was part of the PDG that we had this year that was something we could determine ourselves on top of the school allocations, and that was a smoothing grant element. We understand that is there because there has been some impact on parents applying for preschool meal eligibility since the rollout of universal free school meals. So we believe that sum of money was there to try and protect and cushion schools where their free school meal numbers had gone down. And that's how we did use that funding. Locally, we determined that we would just make sure nobody actually lost out from their previous allocation. There are, like I said, some of the terms and conditions on the grant for schools to have to say how they are spending the funding. But to be fair, for these now the school standards and PDG, the conditions have really sort of slackened off since the grant streams have gone into that wider local authority education grant. So whereas before schools had to publish their spend plans online as part of their school development plan, there's no longer a requirement for them to do that with these grants, which are quite sizable, as you stated.
Okay, so in terms of the pupil development grant, I mean that's specifically aimed at free school meals. In other words, to try to raise the educational standards of pupils who are well living in deprived areas, etc. Do we actually monitor how the schools are using that and maybe spread best practice among schools on using that grant?
Yes, I mean, our school improvement advisors have traditionally used the monitoring of these grants as part of one of their core visits. This year, I believe, is the first year that we didn't have to report back through the actual grant terms and conditions. But I'm pretty sure that as part of their core visits, the school improvement advisors will be looking to make sure those improvements are still going ahead. As you said, it is to narrow the gap, isn't it, between learners who are on free school meals and those who aren't.
Okay, so they'll spread best practice to the schools as well, presumably. So if they see something which is really working well, they'll sort of tell the other schools, have you looked at this, for example?
Thanks very much, Peter. You'd like to come in?
Thanks, Chair. Just to come back in on Councillor Black's question on the monitoring of PDG, Scrutiny Panel for Schools for Education has traditionally been monitoring PDG on an annual basis. So scrutiny reports have been quite detailed in terms of the effective practice across schools. Obviously, the requirement to publish PDG PDG plans online has always been there historically as well. And we've had more than one internal audit on the use of PDG across Swansea schools. So there's been a good level of monitoring over a number of years on that one.
Right. I'm glad to see Lyndon's panel's doing its job. Excellent, thank you.
Cool. Thanks very much. Councillor Jenkins, do you want to come in? Sorry I missed you earlier.
That's okay. Okay, I got 3 questions, okay. Just going to call them up here. So I'm looking at 1.4 and it says that at the end it's unhelpful for planning spend particularly when staff need to be employed because the conditions for the grants come after the money. So my question is, what are you doing at the moment so that unhelpfulness and planning can be resolved and addressed? So that's my first question. The second question is on 1.7, where it says that you're going to write the Welsh Government with a request for funding instead of an additional ad hoc grant. So I'd like to know who have you written to there and what's been the response to that? Because the feedback said the schools would prefer funding to come through their delegated budgets instead of ad hoc grants. That's the second question. And the last one really is I note that 19% of your resources are coming through these grants. And the question really is, they've all come now from a predominantly Welsh Labour government. And what if these grants are they in tablets of stone? I don't think they are, reading this report. So if they're not available, and given that it's like a fifth of the budget, what's the plan B? If they're taken away by a future different government?
Okay, I'll come in on Councillor Jenkins's question on 1.4 in relation to the understanding that the terms and conditions normally follow the amounts. It would be a great world to live in if we had grant stabilisation that covered at least 3 years, so we'd know that the terms and conditions would be similar as well as the amounts being similar. That would really help us with planning. I think what we're trying to do to mitigate the risk of this happening again is that when we consider our staffing needs, because some of the local authority education grant, that £31 million worth of grant, is utilised for central staffing as well, as Kelly has alluded to. So what we're trying to do is to consider any future priority jobs that would supplement our core staffing and creating those job descriptions and having them in our back pocket ready should the need arise or should there be an increase in grant in future years. So we're trying to mitigate it that way. But generally speaking, obviously the local authority education grant is relatively new. It has subsumed a number of grant lines. I think there were about 33 grant lines 2 years ago. And broadly speaking, they've been divvied out into 4 subsections that Kelly's mentioned. That's been helpful in its own right. So I think what we're trying to do is spend proportionately, obviously devolving as much grant as we can to schools, but also keeping some back in the centre so that we can provide support services to schools. And the kinds of support services we provide are around teaching and learning, curriculum, things like literacy and numeracy, which are our corporate plan objectives, and ensuring we have some staffing and resource available around those key priority areas as they've emerged recently. But it's really difficult to predict what the terms and conditions are going to be from year to year, and that does hamper our planning.
Thanks very much. Is that okay, Councillor Jenkins? Do you want to come back in?
Yeah. So the have you been dealing with anybody there that are prepared to move on it, or have we just reached deadlock on it and it remains the same?
I think as directors of education, what we try and do is work with Welsh Government to influence the agenda around stabilisation of grants. So obviously we do feedback. I've just had the opportunity to be with other directors last week on that very matter to talk about resources and grants flowing our way. So we've had an opportunity collectively to speak as directors to say that we'd much prefer to have a solid kind of idea of what grants will look like in future, and that the terms and conditions don't jump or change from year upon year.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Just picking up on what Councillor Jenkins has just mentioned, and it might be picking up on what you said earlier, Councillor Smith. Have we seen the grant situation? So have we seen more grant funding within the education in the last few years? So less core funding and more grant funding? And what is the medium? What's the length of time from the medium-term plan? I see that's mentioned when setting the medium-term financial plan. Grants are accounted, ensuring exit strategies. But how long is that medium-term plan? I know in health it's 3 years, or it's meant to be 1 to 3 years.
Technical responsibility.
Yeah, so our medium-term financial plan usually covers the next 3 years as well. Without having the figures in front of me, I would say that the balance is more or less stable, really. I would think around about the same percentage of grant compared to core funding, although you know, we have put additional funding in to schools into their core funding this financial year. But yes, some of the grants that we've had, the PDG in particular, and the school standards, which was EIG, are quite substantial and always have been quite substantial grants going out to schools.
It's sort of picking up on Councillor Jenkins' point that that's quite a substantial amount of grant funding, isn't it? And if that were to be withdrawn at any particular point, it would really cause or be a significant risk for this organisation. Thanks very much.
Yes, and I think, you know, we've got to, the officers have given a clear overview, I feel, of the way the system operates. But in a way, we've got to take a step back as well. And I mean, I'm going back 20 years when Jane Davison became Minister of Education in Wales and made that commitment that there would be a lot fewer grants and more of the money would be mainstreamed. And I think, you know, that's been the commitment in the 20 years. But we need to look at what the reality is. And I think you've touched on it, Chair. What I think we need to look at, and there's 3 things that I'd like to say. First of all, that very often we're talking about a contribution to costs rather than a grant. It is recognising that services that are provided by education are benefiting. They've got national benefits as well as local benefits. And it's right that there is a significant contribution from national government, whether it's Welsh government or UK government, to those costs. It's a way of directing funding to specific areas, and I think the PDG is one of those examples. There were various iterations of this before the raise grants and so on, various ways that of addressing that basic issue of the narrowing the gap in the achievement of pupils, trying to overcome the impact of deprivation on education, as you can't divorce what happens in the classroom from children's broader lives. And I think that's why that was brought in. It's an approach that's adopted across the UK. It's an approach that's adopted in other countries. And I think Councillor Black is right. It's about sharing good practice. It's about understanding how schools are using it and what is the most effective use of that funding in different contexts. And then the grants as well, they're a way of pump priming new ways of working, which I would say should be for a transitional period. And once you've got that way of working in place, then there's the argument then that money should be mainstreamed.
Yeah.
So I think that there are those kind of broader policy issues that we need to think about. Is this a bureaucratic system? Is there an easier way of achieving what these grants are trying to achieve, recognizing that there are different aims for the different ones? Another one then, of course, is the capital maintenance funding. Well, we won't go into that. That is one of the ones that I could see people smiling. There was an example of funding being allocated late in the day. In fact, it came, I think, announced on the last day of the school term in the last financial year. Now, that means that there's been all sorts of ways of getting the money spent to qualify for the grant, for the terms of the grant and so on. But that doesn't help, and let's recognize as well that is a contribution to a service that, rather than a grant given by anyone for the sake out of the kindness of their own hearts, this is a service that has national as well as local benefits, as I said at the start.
Yeah, thanks very much, Councillor Smith. I think most of us online, or maybe one or two of us in the room, we're all school governors, or the majority of us are school governors, and we all recognise those furrowed brows, you know, when they're coming into a financial meeting at the end of at the start of a new educational term, and at the end of the last one. And it's the uncertainty. We always hear, you know, such concern about the uncertainty of the grant system. But
to think about it, it would be unthinkable, I feel, for the PDG, for instance, to be withdrawn. You know, that is going against the whole gambit of Welsh government policy and public policy in the OECD, I would say.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think the term grant is a help. It is funding, and it's a way of funding that Welsh government are giving to enable schools to address a specific and key issue within education. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, you're right to point out the risk, and I think it's the quality of our mitigations and controls against that risk that count. So obviously all our officers in education are acutely aware of the need to be careful with employment issues. So we do have the ability to second in from schools on a temporary basis. So that's one mitigation. I think history tells us as well that we haven't had a cliff edge effect on grants falling off dramatically. We tend to have the tapering off from Welsh Government when it comes to grant ending or grant changing.
No, I think from a government's perspective, you're doing everything the right way and everything that you can. So thank you for that. Thanks very much. I've got Ben Smith. Would you like to come in? Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to provide some wider context and follow up on a number of things that Helen and others have said. In the same vein, I, as one of the 22 treasurers, have that same opportunity to feed back through Society of Welsh Treasurers to Welsh Government officials to try and achieve that rationalisation of education grant. And then you've got the political channels through the wider WLGA for the same point, for the discussions you've already made. I think, to be fair to Welsh Government officials and to recognise that there has been movement, especially over LAEG, the commitment given by officials and ministers was that education would be the first to have a degree of rationalisation. And in recent years, that rationalisation has clearly achieved. I think Kelly referenced 33 different individual streams down into the 4 main chunks. That is certainly administratively more beneficial. There are still some stragglers in there that I think we'd all like to see in terms of the disproportionate burden of administering them. But I think equally the point that Councillor Smith made is an important one. Whilst we use the phrase grant because it is made as a specific grant offer, they do typically fall into sort of three categories. Things that people bid for, there aren't that many of them in education, most of them are given. And I think he is right, many of them are top-ups to funding, because irrespective of the push for officers and members for it to be as much in block grant as possible for the reasons of being assured, having some certainty over forward planning, given our external auditors always say, what's your 30, 40-year long-term plan? And we go, well, we don't even know next year's grants on tens and tens of millions. I think those messages are important, but I think he's right to reflect that some of them do reflect political choices and necessary operational choices, where formula is great up to a point, but there are always going to be some things that's going to be relative flavour of the month. I do agree with him that it works best where these are targeted to start with, and then if and when they're proven, they get baselined in. We do see an awful lot of examples of RSG transfers in recent years, and as Kelly has made clear, broadly speaking, it's relatively flat. We don't assume we're going to make a huge amount on forward grants. We don't directly assume we're going to lose them unless it's been openly trailed. They're going to be lost. And I think that point made by Helen is a correct one, that there tends to be a bit of a planned tapering down rather than a cliff edge. And I equally think it would be unlikely and unconscionable for, say, the whole of PDG to suddenly go. It would be only if it were as a transfer in. But given it's for a specific purpose, there is a logic, and I do accept that at a political level and a educational operational level, pan Wales, there may be some that will always be retained. But I think it should be noted that officials have moved significantly, and education was the first to see quite a significant degree of rationalisation. And just the final point I'd make on wider budget planning, which is difficult because we don't know our revenue support grant from year to year, let alone 3 years hence in terms of medium-term plan or spending reviews. Absolutely, our official position is if a grant ends, we start on the basis that we have to end it. That applies whether it's in a school setting, in an education setting, or any other setting. But obviously, the earlier we know about the grants, the better, because that's the best chance at which there is an opportunity for the ruling administration through Cabinet in its recommendations and ultimately Council to decide whether anything is so compelling or deserving that if it were to end, that we make the choice locally to reinstate it. But the starting position is if the grant ends, the service ends, and there are risks with that. And I couldn't help, I was one of those smiling, as I'm sure you saw, in terms of things like the evidence on the capital maintenance and things coming on the 30th of March and the 31st of March. Those of you that know me well will know I often colloquially refer to them as lastminute.com under the mattress money. And I'm obviously always grateful for money turning up, but we do sometimes have to be a little bit inventive in terms of washing it through for outturn, especially given the complicated interaction with schools. Always grateful for the money, but as was noted early doors, it can, I think Kelly referenced it, result in some distortion in terms of then a ballooning of schools' reserves, which can often be subject to great debate. It certainly doesn't help the position in terms of explaining publicly why suddenly schools' reserves may go up rather than expected to go down. But those do make a complex interplay. I thought I'd just come in and give some general stuff because this is the first of the ones you're going through, but it is an area where there has been some significant progress by Welsh Government. Do I think all specific grants will go and will achieve the mantra of knowing everything with certainty in block grant? I think that's unlikely, but I think you've made the right points and the right points of inquiry, and officers have rightly pointed out that some of them are likely to stay for quite some time for valid policy and legitimate education reasons. So that's all I wanted to say, Chair, in terms of trying to put a bit of a flavour on it. If I can, I'll intend to come to the various main meetings just to give an overarching view on the wider stuff on top, if you find that useful. If equally you'd be more than happy for me to not intervene and comment on that, I'm equally happy to sit behind the silence. But I thought I'd definitely come to the first one and gauge whether you wanted some sort of overarching overview on all of them, given you're going through a number of discrete areas. But hopefully that's of help. If it's not, I'm more than happy to not contribute on the wider bits and just let you get on with it. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ben. I think your expertise is most sought after and welcome, so thanks very much. Councillor Black, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just really in a sense carrying on Ben's view on Ben's crystal ball approach to these things. Rather scarily, by the way, it's 26 years since Jane Davidson was became Education Minister, which is quite worrying for those of us who were there at the time. The local education authority grant, the local authority education grant, rather, it's a very substantial amount of money, as I think has been already said, and also funds some very important core services. So I'm just wondering, because what I've always noticed, and certainly when I was an Assembly member noticed this, is But the RSG is agreed, I think, around January, early February, and the local authorities are notified, so they're able to then budget accordingly by I think the middle of March. But these grants always come much later than that, and sometimes can be very late indeed in terms of being notified when you actually how much you're going to get. So I'm just wondering how disruptive of that is that to planning. And are we able to sort of work our way through that? I mean, obviously we have to work our way through it. But how disruptive is that when sometimes these grants are particularly revenue grants of this size and this importance are announced quite late? You don't know exactly how much you're going to get until sometime into a small amount of time into the financial year.
Perhaps if I come back first on that one, Chair, in terms of the risks and planning assumptions I take, Councillor Black is quite right. I mean, we normally get indicative settlement late December, but it's then finalised January, more recently February. And the grant terms and the actual allocation comes later. To some extent, officers, through experience and reading of the runes and keeping every extremity crossed, try to make an assumption that it's broadly neutral, or we try to flex it a little bit. To some extent, we do, when we get the settlement specifically by authority, we do tend to get a table pan Wales, both at preliminary settlement and at final settlement. There are always several items that are in as TBC. There are always several that are cross-referenced with footnotes where it's play super detective and hunt the thimble as to which ones might be transferred between lines. But to be fair to successive Welsh governments, many of the large ones, by the time we get to settlement, even if we don't know specifically our allocation, they'll give you the block allocation for the whole of Wales. And my starting presumption is if whatever the figure is, and I multiply it by the magic 7.5%, normally 7.5% as an assumption in terms of what we deem our fair share, doesn't work on everything, because some things when it's road lengths and number of sheep and number of bits of coast and other bits and pieces, but broadly on many of them, 7.5, some of them are more like 7, some a little bit higher, tends to sort of give us a bit of a clue. It is a degree of disruption. There's always a bit of a breathing of sigh of relief by officers when it comes in at or about the right amount, or if it doesn't, a bit of mass panic as to trying to work out what's caused it or hasn't caused it. So there are some clues. It's a degree of disruption which doesn't give us entire comfort. It is also part of the reason why ultimately sometimes, I give you advice in terms of carrying an amounting contingency and central inflation, but more for contingency, because if there were something pretty fundamental that dropped out that we hadn't been anticipating but was so critical, members as a whole deciding in terms of council, they might quite late on in the budget setting want to intervene and do something about it. There is at least one instance I can remember in recent memory. At one point, the Ethnic Minority Achievement Service grant was a bit up in the air until the last moment, and we did make arrangements as officers and members to stump up our own cash just in case something didn't turn up. It did resolve itself eventually. So occasionally we have to make some pretty big calls where something significant happens, but normally we get a fair flavour. It's an inconvenience rather than an impossibility, Councillor Black, and that's normally the route round for most things. And 9 times out of 10, it's gone about right using the magic power of roughly 7.5%, according to Banker Ben Land when he licks his finger and waggles it in the air. I do try to do as much crystal ball gazing as possible, and on balance of probability, I'm sometimes relatively lucky on those assumptions, but we sort of kind of muddle through it, and everyone faces the same sort of thing, and it sort of, except it goes a bit with the territory. Thanks.
Thanks.
Would you like to come in now?
Thank you, Chair. Just to supplement Ben's answer, in answer to Councillor Black, I think we have to consider very carefully that the grants afford additionality, as Kelly has mentioned already. So we try and prioritise, we put our resources really where our priorities are. And when we think about our vulnerable learners in Swansea, for example, we heavily prioritise that area, whether it's to reduce NEETs, support attendance, or reduce exclusions. So I think as much as we'd like to devolve as much money as we can to schools, we see the need as well to offer additionality in our services to schools and indeed to individual learners. So that's a key consideration for us. Yes, it's a nuisance, but we do try and predict and project what's coming, Councillor Black, so that we have plans in place ready, and when the money lands and the T's and C's land, we're ready to go with our specific plans on spending.
Thanks very much for that. Thank you. And thanks again to Ben Smith and Councillor Black. Sorry to keep you waiting, Councillor White. Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a query, really. Any regards to grants awards? If the grant isn't actually spent within the allocated time, would this still be subject to perhaps clawback?
Yes, so the majority of grants that we get, the revenue grants, do have to be spent by the 31st of March each year. So we do work with our sort of internal officers and schools to ensure that money is spent as best as it can be. As long as we meet the terms and conditions of the grant, then you can account that money as being spent on the on the grant terms and conditions. So we do try and make sure that we do claim everything that we can, to be honest with you, from the grant, so there's nothing unspent and sent back. Our capital grants can have a little bit more flex with them on occasion, because just of the nature of us normally looking at new build, etc. So we can sometimes negotiate with the awarding body, which is usually the Welsh Government, that we can slip that into another financial year. But yeah, revenue grants have to be spent by the 31st of March.
Yeah, just to follow, are schools then advised of the possibility that they've got to get the funding used by the end of that financial year?
Yeah, we do share the terms and conditions of all the grants with schools, so they should be more than aware of what they need to do with that. And I think it's sort of their bread and butter, really, because they're so used to having these grants every year now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just to supplement Kelly's answer, she mentioned capital grants there. Obviously, the focus of our report this afternoon has been revenue grants, but there are three broad spending areas in relation to capital in education. The first being the intervention grants for capital new builds of schools and modernisation of schools. So that's one example. Second would be community focused schools capital grant. And the third would be additional learning needs capital grant. So those are three broad areas, and if the panel this afternoon requires more information, we can provide that in writing as well on capital if needed.
Thanks very much. Any more questions or observations at this point? And if there aren't, we'll release them. Everybody happy, content? Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your attendance. It was very comprehensive. Thanks. Can I thank everybody that contributed to that? It's a very worthwhile session, so thanks. Item 9, project plan in terms of reference. You've all been given a list of the grants that are available, and there is one or two areas that I've pulled out that we may want to look at. Is there anybody that has any specific grant that they want to delve into? And I expect everybody's hand to go up. And no one's did. So if we read a list that we had a short briefing earlier, and so you have a list. If there's anything you want to add to what we may want to put forward, then please by all means do. These are just my thoughts at the moment. So
shall I just read the list out, and then you can have a think about anything that you'd like? We're thinking of maybe getting initially inviting maybe 6 to 8, because obviously only some will come. We may not get engagement of all who we invite, and we can then move down the list. But we've got quite a selection of different grant bodies that provide grants to the local authority. A lot of them will go through the Welsh Government, so I would assume that you'd want to speak to the Welsh Government as a main one, because there's a lot of other stuff under that, like the Home Office and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Department for Work and Pensions, which contribute grants towards the authority, but they must come through the Welsh Government. So I would assume you'd want to speak to the Welsh Government as the holder of those. But there are a number of other bodies. There's the Welsh Local Government Association, Police and Crime Commissioner. We've got Public Health Wales, which Councillor Hale said would be quite good to speak to. We've got National Academy for Education and Leadership in Wales, the West Hill Endowment, which I don't know if anyone knows what that is. Sorry, we've got Councillor Black. Did you want to?
Yes, Councillor Black.
Yeah, I think the list is quite useful, and there's 42 bodies on there altogether. But what I'm not clear about is what grants they actually give. So I think it'd be useful if I mean, West Hill Endowment is one. There's one further down, which is I don't know if I can pronounce it. Luigi and Laura Dalla Piccola Foundation, for example, or something similar to that. I mean, if we knew exactly what those grants were and how much that money was involved in each grant, and I think from that point on we could then say, well, okay, this is only £5,000, so that's not really worth looking at, or this is a bit more than that, and that's actually quite a key service. I mean, I'm not sure, for example, what the Arts Council for Wales give to the local authority either. So it'd be useful to actually know what exactly they're giving us, which I think better inform our decision making in terms of what we want to ask questions on.
Good point. Thanks very much, Councillor Black.
Yeah, I'll contact Finance and ask her for a little bit more detail on them all, and then we can decide then. Yeah.
Linda, did you want to come in? Councillor James?
Yes, thank you. Could we also include Highways Department, because it's another department that relies heavily on grants?
Yeah, we should have them coming in on the 7th of July as part of the Place department. They'll be doing a report similar to this, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. And Councillor White?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, following up on Councillor Black's comments regarding, as you said, some of the grants obviously are sort of minuscule in amount, really. Is it possible for us to draw, like, the organisations there, if we had sort of had a sort of ceiling, say possible 20k or something like that, rather than plus go and try and contact or ask everybody to sort of be involved? I don't know how we feel about that, Chair, or the panel.
That's it, unless you want a sort of a cross section of different, I mean, they may have different issues, might they? Smaller grant.
Yep.
May provide. So whether you want a sort of cross section of different types of grant givers, I don't know. It's I suppose something you can decide on, really, isn't it?
Yeah. What I felt was, if we had a sort of an actual ceiling, the amount, then we know that we could then ones that are obviously lower grants, we could obviously just discard them in a sense, because the amount's been so small.
Yeah, I suppose some of the grant givers would give a number of different grants. I suppose that was sort of add it up into a larger grant. I should imagine the National Lottery probably give lots of little grants, don't they? I would suspect.
Thanks for that, Mike. Jeff, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Well, a similar concept to Councillor White with regard to a ceiling. But I noticed there are 6 or is it 7 sections? It's education, place, social services, and that was it. I thought it'd be wise to have either 1 or 2 topics from each of those sections. Well, we're looking at education at the moment, so it cancels that one out. But perhaps from the other services that are offered. The other grant services, yeah. So we cover then a range of. So
we got a good spread.
Topics.
Yeah,
a good spread indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Any other comments? No? So once we get what type of grant that's being provided, then we can send that information out and then I suppose prepare for the next meeting.
Yeah, the next meeting will be with social services.
Yes.
So I can bring that along to that and you can have a discussion then, or I'll send it around in advance anyway, and you can send me your thoughts and we'll put a list together. I was thinking of hopefully trying to get the meeting in end of July, August time if we can.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Everybody happy with that? Oh, Councillor O'Brien?
Thank you, Chair. I know Helen mentioned that there's the capital funding as well, and she mentioned that she'd be happy to provide sort of details on that. That I don't know if anyone else would be interested in that, but I know I certainly would be in terms of sort of the future spending on schools in Swansea, if we're able to ask for that information.
I actually have the last education panel. We actually had an update on that very thing.
Amazing.
So rather than providing it again, maybe I can send that around by email if that's okay.
Yeah, no,
that presentation detailed it in quite detail what the spend's
brilliant.
going to be.
Thanks, Michelle. That was perfect. Thanks, Chair.
Be very useful. Thanks. So if there's no more comments, observations, questions, we'll call it to a close. It's still very sunny, so you're all right. Thanks very much. Thanks for those who attended. Thank you. Ta-ra.
Thanks, Chair. Bye all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.